Welcome to The View on GU, the place to be for translating uro-oncology knowledge to action. Here are your hosts, Drs. Aly-Khan Lalani and Christopher Wallis.
Hello and welcome to The View on GU. I'm Aly-Khan Lalani, joined by my co-host Chris Wallis. Chris, it's post-summer. Colors are changing a little bit. Tell us what you did over the summer break.
Absolutely. You know, as a redhead, always colors start changing for me when the sun comes out. We don't have to wait for fall. So I was lucky. I got an invite to speak at the Eurofair in Singapore in July. So I was able to drag the family over to Southeast Asia, and we had a really great summer. How about you? I know you often bear the brunt of, being the guy left behind while everyone goes traveling.
Yeah, I try and stick around. I enjoy Toronto over the summer, and then end of August, early Labor Day, took off to Portugal and spent some time in Madeira and Comporta, and luckily avoided the unfortunate tragedy in Lisbon with the trolleys. But no, it was great, and we're back at it, heavy into conference season, and lots to come for our listeners and viewers. And, something, Chris, you and I were just chatting off camera that for a long time, we've been wanting to do a theme of drug approval, particularly in Canada, but something that could be applied around the world. And we're really pleased that we can realize this to fruition today with part one. And I'm really pleased to present Sudha Kutty, who's the Executive VP, Evidence, Protocols and Services at Canada's Drug Agency. Welcome, Sudha. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Do you want to know what I did over the summer?
Absolutely. Please share. Tell us about it.
I renovated my kitchen. So I was not in Portugal or Singapore. I was renovating my kitchen. So that was my summer.
And is that done or still an ongoing process?
It's done. It's phenomenal. Okay. I highly recommend it.
Okay. All right. We'll have to keep that in mind. And construction or vacation summers looks like they've been fruitful for all of us. So let's talk a little bit about this drug approval process in Canada. Maybe let's zoom out and start with the so-called W5 of Canada Drug Agency. Our listeners and viewers have variable insight or knowledge about this, things like CDEC, FMEC, PERC. Maybe you can just take us through the who of the Canada Drug Agency.
Yeah, so thanks for asking. And firstly, thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm really glad to be here and really glad to talk about sort of what we do day in and day out at Canada's Drug Agency. So let me just maybe geek out on governance for a moment here. So despite having agency in our name, we're actually a pan-Canadian health organization. We're an independent not-for-profit. And really importantly, we're funded by Canada's federal government, provincial and territorial governments. We also receive some industry funding for our drug reimbursement review process. And the governance piece is we have a board. So we have a 13-member board with jurisdictional representatives. We have 2 health system representatives. We have 2 public members, one of whom is a person with lived experience. We have an academic rep, and then we also have an observer from INES. So we have a very robust governance structure and very sort of hybrid in nature in terms of our oversight. And I think that's important to understand. And at the heart of what we do, we deliver evidence analysis and advice and recommendations to healthcare decision makers so they can make informed decisions. So I'm going to talk about the drug approval continuum in a moment, but ultimately we issue these reimbursement recommendations based on clinical and economic comparative effectiveness of new treatments. And this is really an important part of assessment within a publicly funded system, which is what we have in Canada. And we do this through the lens of a health technology assessment. And I can talk about that as well.
Oh, that's a great overview. And maybe just the components of CDA, and we're going to get into HTA in just a second in that process. But maybe for our listeners and viewers to hear a little bit about the differences, because it's more than oncology drugs. Obviously, that's our interest. But CDEC, FMET, PERC, can you take us through just at a high level for our listeners and viewers?
Sure. The alphabet soup of our committees.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 2 core committees that review what I'd call sort of branded products or sponsored drugs. One is CDEC, which is the Canadian Drug Expert Committee. That committee reviews non-oncology pharmaceuticals. And then the ones that your listeners are most familiar with or most interested in is our pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review Expert Review Committee, PERC. It's a mouthful, which is why we call it PERC. So PERC reviews oncology pharmaceuticals. There's 17 voting members on PERC, and Aly-Khan, you're a member of PERC, as you know. And it's a broad range of expertise. On PERC, we have a chair, we have 3 patient members, we have an ethicist, and everybody on PERC, all the other members have an understanding of cancer, diagnosis, treatment, care, and expertise, and sort of a broad range of expertise in either hematology, medical, surgical, or radiation oncology, general internal medicine, pharmacology, health economics, and health policy. So a broad range of expertise brought to the table to review these drugs. We have a third expert committee called FMEC, our Formulary Management Expert Committee. That committee reviews drugs. They're called non-sponsored. They're at the behest of the drug plans. These are typically drugs that have lost exclusivity. So not really relevant for this audience, but those are our 3 core expert committees. And it's through these expert committees that we do our work and make the drug reimbursement recommendations.
Absolutely. I think that's like a super helpful grounding background for us. And in the context of, oncology, we're probably going to narrow in on PERC a little bit, but maybe you can walk us through, the HTA process that may be considered, and Health Canada approvals relative to PERC and PCPA, and how we get from, data to, the ability to prescribe.
Great question. So health technology assessment, it's an actual method, right? It's a multidisciplinary process that uses explicit methods to determine value of a health technology at different points in its life cycle. And why we stress this is the point of having HTA, and there are many HTA bodies across the world. NICE in the UK as an example. You mentioned Singapore. Singapore has an HTA body. The whole point of HTA bodies is you're avoiding undue influence and bias. You're using systematic methods and tools to ultimately determine value and determine, ultimately make a reimbursement recommendation. And this is not something, as I said, that we alone do. This is, a common process that HTA bodies across the world use to do their work and ultimately to end up in that final decision or recommendation. The drug approval process, and your listeners will know this, is multi-layered in Canada. And I use that term very specifically. I firmly believe that each layer has a role and a part to play. I think it's important to understand the difference between everyone's role. So Health Canada, as the regulator, conducts a regulatory review. And so as the name suggests, Health Canada is looking to review safety, efficacy, and quality. Do the benefits of this drug outweigh the risks? Can the risk be mitigated? And once that drug is approved, the drug is authorized for sale in Canada. It gets a drug identification number, a DIN. We conduct the next step in that process, which is called the health technology assessment. This can be sequential, but we are actively working with Health Canada around what we call an aligned review. So a review that happens in parallel, and that ultimately speeds up the timelines. We do our work for all of Canada, and Quebec does, INES does the work in Quebec. And so what we're looking at is, this idea of comparative effectiveness. So how does the drug that we're looking at compare effectively to other treatments, but either indirectly or head-to-head? And so then ultimately, should the drug be publicly funded? Should it be reimbursed, and under what conditions? We make those recommendations. The recommendations are non-binding, but ultimately those recommendations go to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, who is the next step, the next layer in the process. That group, as you're aware, ultimately negotiates on behalf of the provinces and territories, and then a final funding decision is made, ultimately to each of the provinces and territories determining when and how to list on the public formulary. I mentioned provinces and territories. In there as well are the 6 federal drug plans, as well as Canadian Blood Services, which we don't need to get into. But I appreciate that to people on the outside. This looks like a very multi-step process. It is, but I would argue that every step adds something in this chain. And in a publicly funded system like Canada, I'm not actually entirely sure how else we would do this, right? At some point, there has to be some determination and assessment of comparative clinical and cost effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, that's a little bit of our responsibility maybe as stewards in the healthcare system, particularly thinking as academic physicians trying to bring things through the whole spectrum, but certainly as any of us who write prescriptions, it's key to know that we're making decisions not just for the individual patient, but in the context of our whole healthcare system. So I think you gave a really good framework there, and you kind of already got into this, but can you walk us through like a process, or if a file is presented, it comes forward to PERC. How does a file get handled? What's the sort of touch points between industry and this decision-making process, and how do we sort of keep this? I think we talked already about how HTA is a structured sort of objective process, but we make sure that this is a process sort of free of undue influence, but coming to a beneficial outcome for our patient populations.
Yeah, so great question. I'm really happy to walk through this. I think there's a few things to understand, and you talked a little bit about, you hear about a trial at a conference and then you sit and wait and wonder what's happening. I heard about this a year ago. The first thing to understand is we cannot review a file until it is approved by Health Canada. Health Canada cannot review a file until they receive the file. And so if, and this happens, right? So a sponsor may decide to submit in another country, and they may delay filing, for another year into Canada. So Health Canada can't do anything until that actual file is submitted to them. So now Health Canada has a file. I've already mentioned that we can review in parallel, and we encourage that. But we can't review the file until the sponsor files with us. And it's up to them as to when to do that. Sometimes there's a filing gap. Sometimes they file with Health Canada, they receive approval, and they wait a little while before filing with us. So it's important to know that our trigger for a review is an actual application or submission by the sponsor. We receive the file. There's a little bit of back and forth as we're doing a bit of screening. Then we accept the file, and then we begin our review. And so quite a lot goes into the review. There's sort of the review of the clinical evidence that is submitted by the sponsor. There is input from patient groups, input from clinician groups, which your audience will know very well. We get input from the public drug plans. And more recently, we've started to get input from a person with lived experience presenting to the committee. We started that at FMEC, and we'll be starting that at CDEC and PERC in October of this year. All of these inputs form sort of part of the material that is put before the committee. And we like to think of our work in sort of three phases, sort of this input phase, this throughput phase, where all these inputs go to the expert panel and they deliberate, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the output phase, which is our actual recommendation report. And so, through this, the staff are sort of supporting the work all along, but it's all these other inputs that form the richness of the conversation. And Aly-Khan, I'm sure you can attest to this. The conversation and the deliberation at these committees is very rich. It is a lot of sort of back and forth conversation, referencing these different inputs and walking through a very structured process to ultimately land on the reimbursement recommendation, which is the output and then documented in that recommendation report.
I would agree. It's a fulsome process, a very vigorous conversation we have. We give these files a lot of time and thought even prior to review. You may have mentioned it, but there's clinical experts that are asked as part of CDA to answer questions from the PERC table. So, this certainly gets a full scrutiny, and I think it's a very lively conversation with the various members, as you've mentioned. So we're going to get into innovation in a little bit, but you've taken us through the process really beautifully. So let's talk about these new domains, the deliberative framework. We've kind of gone through this update recently on our file review, but it might be helpful for our listeners and viewers to know, okay, what are the big buckets, or what is this framework we use to come to that decision? Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, I can. And maybe before I do, I want to go back to the clinical expert, because I actually neglected to say that. And so thank you for reminding me. When I gave you the overview of who is on PERC, it's a broad range of expertise. We also have 2 to 3 clinical experts specific to the cancer in question that's being discussed. And so those experts bring that additional, very specific clinical lens to the conversation. So thank you for reminding me, and sorry that I didn't mention that. So now to your question on the deliberative framework. So the deliberative framework has 5 domains of value, and I'll just sort of go through them very quickly. Clinical value, and then I'll be more specific. Clinical value, unmet clinical need, distinct social and ethical considerations, economic considerations, and then impacts on health systems. And the point of having these 5 values and having this deliberative framework is that every single deliberation will go through each of these domains in an order. Each of them will be considered. Some of them will have, will drive the conversation perhaps more so than others, but at least there's a consistency and a framework that is ultimately followed. This was a framework that we sort of finalized and formalized and trialed through FMEC, and I think PERC now is starting to sort of pick up the framework, as is CDEC, and that was sort of part of our overall innovation initiative from last year. And so if I could just speak to the 5 domains with more clarity, sort of clinical value is really, what value do the patients derive from this particular drug and the terms of the effect on their health? Unmet clinical need is obvious. Is there an unmet clinical need served by this particular drug? Sometimes there are distinct social and ethical considerations, equity deserving groups that are impacted disproportionately by this particular disease. Other types of considerations that need to be considered. Economic, this is obviously where the cost effectiveness piece comes into play. And then broader impacts on health systems. There are some technologies, when they're introduced into the health system, have dramatic effects around adoption implications and the feasibility of adoption. We saw this as an example with something like a Pluvicto as an example, right? So certain drugs have sort of a lot that has to happen to implement them into a very complicated health system. And so we think as well, one of the domains of value is this idea of impact on health systems and feasibility. So the whole point of this is to have structure around conversation and consistency, conversation by conversation.
I think that's like super interesting. And it's obviously a very complex process. And so I guess one of the things that sort of harkens back to a comment we made before, which is, you need to be initiated by the sponsor, but what is a reasonable time frame to pull off all this sort of complex analysis, back and forth conversations, consultation with expert? What is reasonable? What are the internal benchmark targets?
Yeah. So this is a very hotly debated topic, and so let me just sort of put our perspective on the table. We have a performance metric, and our performance metric is 180 days. And that is 180 days from the moment we accept the file to the moment we publish the draft recommendation. And let me explain why. When we receive a submission, as I said, there is a back and forth period, right? You haven't submitted this, we still require this, and so forth. And so we actually start our metric when we accept and say, yes, this is good to go. We then go as far as draft recommendation because there are some things that happen after the draft recommendation stage that I can talk about shortly. So our performance metric is 180 days. We have, in 2024, we achieved that metric 92% of the time. The 6 or so odd cases where we didn't were factors outside of our control, where there was a review that was pending a Health Canada decision, where there was a temporary suspension. So these are things that sort of skew the mean, and these are outliers. When we look at our mean, we actually are around 166 days. Our median, when you remove those outliers, is 147 days. So that's kind of the time frame that it takes. There is always an interest in going faster and streamlining that timeline. And I understand that and I appreciate that. Part of this is the need to pull the material together, the need to schedule the expert panel. So there's a bunch of factors that go into play, but that's ultimately what our timeline looks like.
I think, it's one of those old sayings, right? You can have it fast or good or cheap, but you can never get all three. And so I feel like that's, a very reasonable consideration is at most you can pick 2 out of the 3 of those lists. So, I think it translates to us most commonly when we see positive, recommendations coming out of, PERC and other organizations. But what happens when a negative decision comes through and the committee's recommending against reimbursement, particularly in the context of a Health Canada approval?
Yeah. So first, let me maybe tell you our statistics. So 97% of our recommendations last year, we had 30 recommendations. So 29 out of 30 were in favor of reimbursement. And I believe this year we're trending all so far have been in favor of reimbursement. And when I say in favor of reimbursement, it's typically reimbursed with clinical criteria and or conditions. We've had a handful of do not reimburse over the last 4 or 5 years. And so when we talk about our decisions, maybe I'll just sort of flip the language a little bit, and not so much around negative. We actually have sort of 4 dispositions, right? We have reimburse, we have do not reimburse, and we have reimburse with conditions. And reimburse with conditions is usually economic and sometimes clinical. I'll speak about that in a minute. And later we might speak about our 4th newest recommendation criteria, which is reimburse for a time-limited period. But we'll park that for later conversation. The reimburse with clinical conditions, the vast majority of our recommendations are sort of in this space. And these are going to be conditions not only around economic conditions, right? So sort of a cost reduction, but also conditions around initiation, discontinuation criteria, feasibility of adoption. So these are all the types of clinical conditions that sort of go into this bucket. And they're a really important part of this pan-Canadian formulary management, right? So we're sort of trying to do this across the country in a way that's not duplicative, which is what it was before. And so trying to make this feasible and manageable for the entire country. And so this is kind of the importance of our conditions. So when there's a recommendation that the sponsor is not satisfied with, so perhaps they don't like the condition or perhaps there's a do not reimburse, they can file what's called a reconsideration. And they can file this within 10 days of getting the draft recommendation. This reconsideration can go back to subcommittee or the whole committee, and then the decision can either stand or be altered. If they have new evidence, they can file what's called a resubmission, and that can also then be sort of reconsidered by the committee. So remember when I talked about timelines and I said I would come back to timelines? If there's a reconsideration, that then extends the timeline further, right? So now you're going back to the committee again. About 20% of our files go to reconsideration, and that can extend anywhere from 60 to 100 days. And so all of these factors sort of change what the number looks like. And so, we often see, CDA doesn't meet their metrics. We do meet our metrics, but there's a lot more nuance to the data than perhaps is being portrayed externally.
Yeah, and I think all those processes are super important. The numbers on the zoom out look fairly positive, but you're right, there's still that scrutiny at an individual file level that any of those options are potentially foreseeable. So that's really helpful to know. I might pivot to a few rapid fire ones, and we're not live, so we don't have live studio audience, so to speak, but I think there are some questions that I can imagine would come up. So let's my first one will be innovation. So you kind of hinted at this, but there's something new called PACES, which we've already undergone this year. There's time-limited reviews you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about those two or the new innovation additions to the armamentarium that PERC has?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying we've really been actively pushing innovation and actively thinking about, and I don't want your listeners to hear me say it's acceptable to wait this long. Like I appreciate clinicians, I appreciate patients waiting for that drug that they've heard has been approved, a little while ago. So we're always looking at, is there ways that we can go faster? So the whole point with PACES was, up until we launched PACES, every drug receives the same treatment, sort of the kitchen sink, the full Monty, if I could use that expression. There was an idea that, there are some drugs maybe don't require that treatment and can have more of a tailored review process. And so we launched PACES, and PACES stands for, I might get the name wrong, Pharmaceuticals with Anticipated Comparable Efficacy and Safety. Acronym is PACES. And so really these are for drugs in the therapeutic classes with an indication that matches a drug that was previously recommended for reimbursement. So we've sort of seen this one before. It's recommended for reimbursement before. Now it's, same class, same indication, different company. So does it really require everything, the full throttle? And so can we have a more tailored review process? And so that was the whole genesis behind PACES. And so the submission criteria are streamlined for these drugs. They don't go to the full committee. They go to a subset of the committee. This is a model that INES is using. This is a model that Scottish Medicines Agency Committee is using. And so we thought we could trial this in Canada. And so the impact of PACES is that we think we could probably get to draft recommendation within about 100 to 120 days. So shave off some days. And, every time saving is important. So far, we've initiated 2 PACES reviews. I think we have one that we may be posting shortly. It was for a cancer drug. And so that was accepted on May 13th. I think we'll be posting the recommendation. It might actually be up already. So that would have been a 4-month turnaround. And so that is sort of our vision on PACES, that we can take a subset of files and go slightly faster. Should I talk about time-limited recommendations? I think I alluded to that as a 4th kind of recommendation.
Yeah, no, that's great. And just for our listeners and viewers, I think, this is where PACES is trying to not necessarily say a drug is better than all the other competitors. Like if you're 4th through the door, it's to say, at least as you've rightly pointed out, kind of equivalent or near similar efficacy, and not looking to be a superior drug option. So this is very helpful because many disease spaces, GU included, has many trials from many companies looking at the same spot with similar drugs in same classes. So I think I could see that being very helpful in terms of timeliness. And if I thought I saw that chart correctly, so that would also allow PACES kind of a simultaneous PCPA review. Or something where that PCPA portion could be shortened, right?
Yeah. So we've had conversations with PCPA, and we are hoping that they can put a PACES drug through their accelerated pathway, because just like us, they've seen something similar before as well, right? So again, you don't think you have to go from ground zero. You can sort of work off what you had before. The one thing I will mention about PACES is it's up to the sponsor to come forward and say, we think we're a PACES. We're not going to be in the position at this point anyways of saying, we think this is you. It's up to them to just come forward and put themselves forward. Absolutely.
So let's talk about time-limited reviews. Other jurisdictions like US have had some sort of accelerated process. There are many times phase 2 trials that have pending phase 3 confirmatory trials. So yeah, take us through what TLR means.
Yeah, so this is another new novel category that we introduced maybe about 2 years ago. So time-limited recommendation is a recommendation to reimburse a drug for a time-limited period. This is a drug that has an NOCC, a Notice of Compliance with Condition, and the sponsor is going to be conducting their phase 3 clinical trial to address that uncertainty within a 3-year period. And then the intention is that they come back and get reassessed with that new evidence. So typically, before we had a TLR, these typically would get a do not reimburse, right? The uncertainty is too great. There's no phase 3 yet. And what we understood was that, there was a need, obviously, these areas of high unmet need. So was there a way that we could have a time-limited recommendation for a period of time and sort of take a bit of a risk on that evidence coming back after phase 3? And so, as I said, there's a Notice of Compliance with Condition from Health Canada. There's a robust evidence generation plan at this point that includes phase 3. RW is acceptable. Real world evidence is acceptable, but it has to be in conjunction with phase 3. And then there's a requirement to come back for a reassessment. When we launched time-limited recommendations, we launched it with a very small subset of files. We were quite stringent in our criteria because we just wanted to see what this looks like. And so we thought what we would do is we would have 3 or 4 of these, and then we'd assess. Along with our time-limited recommendation category, PCPA launched their PTAP process, which is kind of the corollary negotiation pathway that's tied to the time-limited recommendations. And so far we've had 2 that have gone through, and they showed great promise. So both of them were in the cancer space. So they really reduced the overall timeline. In HER2 and Epkinly are the 2 drugs, dramatically reduce the timelines. And so we're hopeful. We would like more people to sort of step through this pathway. I think this is the thing with both TLR and PACES that we really want people to avail themselves.
And have you, sorry, AK, before you jump to the next one, have you seen any of these come through the full life cycle and maybe have to go through the review of the phase 3 data? And I'm interested in your thoughts or perspectives on what happens if the confirmatory re-review doesn't support the initial TLR recommendation. So what happens if the phase 3 fails where the phase 2 looked okay? How are we going to societally handle those sort of pulling drugs that physicians have gotten used to use?
Yeah. So luckily, I don't have to answer that yet because we haven't had the first one come back through. But it's coming. It's coming quickly. I believe in 2026, I believe the first one's going to come back to us. So have me back on the podcast at that time, I can answer that question. But at this point, I don't have an answer. I think we know what the options are for the committee, but ultimately the committee will, review the evidence, go through the deliberative framework and make their determination.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're excited to see if that day does come, how that looks. I mean, there have been drugs, even in the Canadian market, that based on a phase 3 were available through some kind of compassion or special access until the phase 3 came. And it obviously might have needed to be pulled from many countries. So yeah, stay tuned and we'll certainly have to bring you back as some of these things mature. I think a couple more from me quickly. We talked about innovation. Let's talk about gaps in the current process, kind of from your purview. What is CDA looking to still optimize?
So timelines, I think we can always look at optimizing timelines. I've already talked about these 2 pathways. How do we optimize uptake of those pathways? You started off, well, actually, maybe it was earlier, we were talking a little bit about black box. I think we need to collectively think about how do we become more transparent and become less of a black box. And so this is something we're starting to think about. And then how do we continue to engage with patients and clinicians and sort of tell our story a little bit better than maybe we have? And around patient and clinician engagement, we're evolving our input processes to make it, just easier for people to engage with us in a meaningful way. And so these are some of the things that we're continuing to think about.
Yeah, no, that's great. And hopefully endeavors like this can change from that black box and give a more behind the curtain view that everyone can benefit from. Last quick rapid fire from me. And obviously I want to be sensitive about the environment we're in, but as it applies to Canadians' access to drugs, there's been commentary from leadership in the United States, for example, about what a favored nation status would mean for the US as they evaluate and do their introspection about drug cost, drug approval, and drug access in the US. Can you share a bit about initial thoughts, anything you're able to share about how that has been viewed or how that might impact Canadians when a country like the US with a large market makes a claim like that, and kind of some thinking around that?
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to say I don't have too much to say about that. But what I will say is I'll give you a practical answer. So I'm ultimately a practical person, which is we track our volumes quarter by quarter. And so, we actively look at what were we tracking at last year? What are we tracking at this year? So the first quarter of this year was basically the same as the first quarter of last year. So no change in volumes. This quarter, we have until the end of the month to kind of see how it compares to last quarter. So if we were to see any changes, it might show up in, how many submissions we're receiving. So far, we see pretty well on track. That's maybe as much as I can say, like practically speaking. I haven't seen it yet. That's not to say it's not happening. That's not to say it won't have an impact, but just from my own sort of nose to the grindstone perspective, I'm looking at our volumes of submissions. And so far we seem fairly on track, but we'll know more in the next coming months.
Absolutely. Yeah. You alluded to this, and just before we close, I'm curious for our audience. You mentioned, looking for more engagement with clinicians. So for the audience members who are interested in that engagement, how can physicians get involved in, HTA processes? I know some of us do maybe a little bit of the nitty gritty. I love ITCs and, network meta-analyses, things like that. But more broadly speaking, how can we involve ourselves in the process beyond things like, when CCS asks for our expert, little blurbs?
I guess what I would say is, over the years, I know there have been sort of critiques of our process, critiques of our decisions. What I would say to people in that space, like, join us, like, come and sit on PERC, come and be a clinical expert. If you feel strongly about this, have your voice be part of the conversation. So we, on a regular basis, I think yearly, as sort of numbers change, we recruit for members for PERC. And so all of that information goes up on our website and through our newsletter, The Dispatch. We often look for clinical experts. We have a request for standing offers process also on our website, where if you have particular expertise and we're looking for a clinical expert in that particular cancer, and then obviously the clinical input process that your listeners are fully aware of. But we always want to engage with clinicians. Like, as I've said, there's such a strong role for clinical experts and clinicians on both our committees and at our committees. So we need that perspective. And so, and it's a pretty interesting role. Like, I think Aly-Khan and because you've already talked about ITCs, like takes you a little bit out of your day to day and sort of puts you back into that sort of academic, very mentally stimulating space. So I think it's a really interesting place to be. And the committee is very, just such a great place and lots of great inputs and great colleagues. So I would just sort of say, join us, come and be part of it. And then you kind of get a better sense of what it is we do.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think, when you're interested in drug development and making treatments come to patients as soon as possible, I think being involved in this process was always kind of on my radar at some point in my career. But when it came to do the application, do the interview, be considered for PERC, and now 1 year in this month, I have to say it's a huge honor. I think it is a service. It's a privilege. But as you say, you get to flex different muscles than you do clinically. You get to learn more. For me, getting that population level pharmacoeconomic knowledge, I think has been a huge personal gain. But I'm always amazed at the kind of decisions we review and have the privilege to be part of. And I encourage those. We see a lot of friends and colleagues in the GU field as clinical experts, wherever they live. And I think it's truly a coast to coast to coast kind of experience. So, we didn't put a timer on this episode. We wanted to have a very fulsome conversation. So thank you so much for doing this, and kudos to you and really the whole CDA team for being supportive of joining us. I think we don't really bite. I think we were pretty nice, and yet you got to give us a lot of really good insight that I think our listeners and viewers will want to listen to over and over. So from both of us, thank you so much for joining, Sudha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And, just thank you to all of your listeners, clinicians, patients, all. We are better because of all of you, and really welcome the feedback anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really great to hear from Sudha. Chris, you and I had been thinking about this on walks, Barcelona and even beyond, that we want these behind the curtain episodes more than, in addition to reporting about data and conferences. What did you think?
I mean, I think it's so valuable. I think when we see the data at the meetings, a lot of us get excited, and then, there's that sort of, valley of despair, as it were, between when you see the data, you get all psyched about it when you're actually able to use it in clinic. And I think what's really, interesting and useful coming out of a conversation like that is understanding the rigor and the, process that goes on. It's not, it's not that we're stalling or twiddling our thumbs. We're really critically evaluating how we can best use these new drugs and new agents to benefit our patients, and do it in a way that's sensitive to the needs and constraints of our healthcare system. And so I think it's if anything, for me, I find it very reassuring that the process is very transparent. It's very objective. It has some pretty clearly defined landmarks, and it really makes sure that we're doing right by our system, doing right by our patients. And it's one of those episodes, maybe harkening back to our stats episode from last spring, where this is content that isn't just for a GU prescriber necessarily. This is the kind of thing that I think has real value for anyone trying to think about how we get new drugs on market in Canada.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100% that this is one that should permeate regardless of where you live, what kind of healthcare system you're in. If you research drugs, if you care for patients, you're a patient or a family member and looking for drugs. I mean, I think we constantly do this in clinic. Patients ask, what about this? I've seen this available. What does this access program mean? So there's so many layers to this. And yeah, I would say hopefully this is a beginning of a multi-series episode. We're going to shoot our shot, but it'd be nice to hear about things like Health Canada and things, if we are able to see what the behind the curtain is for PCPA and what's shareable. But I mean, my editorial, obviously disclosures now being on PERC is, yeah, this is a significant process. People feel like it takes a long time, but when we see the assignments for the whole year and we're already getting assignments into spring, I mean, it is packed. And these drugs are, they need time. And by the end of our deliberation, I mean, to have a final PDF that is our decision and rationale, it's a lot of work and it's a privilege. But yeah, the fact that we can do this is good. I mean, I'm struck by the innovation. I mean, PACES was new. These time limited things that kind of can mimic a little bit of accelerated approvals in other countries. I think we need those because a lot of things we treat, Chris, will have, phase 2s that really are unmet needs, variant histology, RCC, other things that it's not easy to do 1,000-person phase 3 trials. So I think that's good. And then things like PACES, you can imagine, we talk every day about which ARPI doublet to go with. So you can imagine how that's perfect for PACES, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot. And then, I had to ask it, but I did want to hear a bit about, what does it mean when neighbors want to be a favored nation with how we have been allowed to have negotiations previously, and what does that impact does that have? So maybe more to come. But no, this is a great way to kick off the fall.
Absolutely. And, there's lots more to come, obviously, this fall. We've got meetings imminently. I think, ESMO obviously looms large. We've got the schedule lacking late breakers. So we'll call it an unofficial schedule to date. And, it's really great that we're going to have Monty Paul on. He's GU stream chair. And so we can get a little preview for our audience before we actually hit the ground in Berlin and start digesting the data. So we'll get a little early insight into what's coming with Monty early October.
Yeah, lots to come. As you mentioned, preview from those who directly review abstracts, ESMO itself, and then even more to come. So with that, I want to thank our listeners and viewers. Thank you for all your support and sticking with us. Hope you all had a great summer. We'll see you shortly as we kick off the fall season. And for Chris Wallis, I'm Aly-Khan Lalani. Talk to you soon.